individuals should expect as they transition into retirement?
Yeah, I'd say one of the things that I find is the most difficult is really just the administrative aspect. You know, when you're working, particularly at the end of your career, you're usually getting a bi-weekly paycheck. Usually it's more than what you're spending, so you've got a little bit of extra cash every month. And then when you transition to retirement and you need to figure out where to get that bi-weekly paycheck from, so to speak, you know, some people are lucky enough to have some of that come from a defined benefit pension, but these days, more often than not, it's trying to figure out when to time government pensions, when and how to take money out of their investments. So that administrative part I find is the most difficult. The second thing, and I think the thing that keeps people up more at night, is how much can I afford to spend in retirement, and that's a much more difficult thing to determine as you convert into the retirement phase.
Fair. We often hear of that 4% rule in your first year of retirement, and that seems to be the prudent approach. Is that accurate in terms of drawing down personal savings?
You know what, it's a decent rule of thumb. It's been around since the early 1990s. There was a financial planner named William Bengen back in 1992, I believe, that first came up with the 4% rule. And the basic idea is whatever the value is of your investments in the year that you retire, you can take out 4% in the first year and then index the dollar amount of that 4% withdrawal every year for the next 30 years, and you probably won't run out of money. You know, more recently, there's been some research done by Morningstar actually that suggested that in Canada that might actually be 3.5% or even 3%. But it depends on a lot of things. It depends on whether you're retiring at 55 or 70, what your life expectancy is. Are you expecting an inheritance or to downsize your home? How do you invest? So rules of thumb I think can be helpful, and that's one of the better ones that I come across, but still it's more art than science, I think, retirement planning.
Fair enough. Obviously one of the challenges of budgeting as a retiree is that you can no longer rely on that same steady paycheck that most people get while they're working. That being said, what would you say are the main steps needed to develop an income plan in retirement?
I think one of the main things that you can do, ideally as far ahead of retirement as possible, is try to identify four things: your assets, your liabilities, your income, and your expenses. Your assets being your home, your investments, your liabilities being your debt. Hopefully you don't have any or very little going into retirement. You know, income, I find there's a lot of retirees I work with that are just upon retirement, and they have no idea how much they're going to get from the Canada Pension Plan or the Old Age Security Pension. So identifying what your income sources are going to be, and then most importantly, expenses. And not the, hey, in a perfect world, if I do everything right, I'm only going to spend this much money. I much prefer people to go back and take a look at what did you actually spend in the last year. And don't go through and pull out all those extraordinary things that, oh, that's not going to happen again, that's not going to happen again, because invariably there's 2 or 3 or 4 or 8 extraordinary things that happen over the course of the year. And you know, just whether on your own or with a professional, try to identify at least those 4 items.
Is it prudent before heading into retirement to test the waters on what you think you might be able to live on? Maybe 2 years, 3 years prior to retirement, whether that's $3,000 a month, $4,000 a month. Should you be testing the waters?
It's a good question. I think if somebody is approaching retirement and knows either that they cannot or will not be able to work much past the next couple of years, I think it makes sense to try to figure out how much can you afford to spend in retirement and see if you can actually do that. I think it's a good way to determine if you can actually retire. And if you find no, you can't, then maybe it reinforces that you need to work a little bit longer, or you need to plan to downsize your home, or you need to take on more risk with your investments, which is probably the least appealing option for most people. And even when you start to convert into retirement, the lifestyle part of actually being retired, some of the people I find that do it best are those who are in a position to be able to go part-time and kind of phase into retirement. Frequently, unfortunately, there's people that an illness occurs, or you know, they lose their job or something happens that it's sudden, and that's a lot harder to get your head around. What do I do with my extra 40 hours a week?
Gotcha. Fair. And we often talk about options of delaying CPP and or OAS payments to maximize guaranteed income in retirement. this can be a good option for people who don't think they have enough saved for retirement or are concerned about longevity risk. In your view, what are some of the scenarios where people may not wish to consider this option?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something that I write about a lot in the media because I find it's often ignored, unfortunately. A lot of people just sort of apply for CPP and old age security at the default ages. You can start CPP as early as age 60 or as late as age 70. With OAS, it's as early as 65 or as late as age 70. The people who are probably best suited to start those pensions earlier are those with a shortened life expectancy, who aren't going to be able to benefit from deferring those pensions. I think if somebody's in a position where they need their CPP or their old age security, they don't have other sources of income or investments, you're in dire straits. I think, starting CPP or old age security is that much more appealing. Potentially somebody who has an aggressive risk tolerance with their investments, who might be able to benefit by leaving their money invested, but even that has a huge asterisk because I find as people get older, the risk tolerance diminishes anyways. Most people, in my opinion, the majority of people would be better suited deferring their pensions, and many Canadians, I think, as late as age 70.
Okay. People both before and during retirement often have to incur large one-time expenses. What other expenses that retirees, what could they expect or be removed from their shoulders as they enter retirement?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times I find people overestimate how much money they need for retirement because they ignore the fact that they're making, large RSP contributions, or they're paying for their children's post-secondary education, or they're finishing paying off their mortgage, or their income taxes are really high and they're actually going to be lower in retirement. More often than not, I do find people end up spending a lot less in retirement than they anticipate once you start to back out some of those other expenses. I think one of the important parts about going through and figuring out what your budget is, what you spend money on, your core living expenses, food, clothing, utilities, property taxes, miscellaneous stuff. That stuff usually doesn't change that much going into retirement. Some of the good studies out there suggest in the first sort of 10 years of retirement, between 65 and 75, you might see a 10% decline in some of those core expenses. And I think that's why it's really important when you go through your budget to figure out what expenses am I going to have forever, what expenses are going to stop at some point, what expenses are fixed and variable. Super important, I think, to go through that budgeting exercise.
So you've got your essential and your non-essential expenses, and I've read articles out there that say that income replacement should be hovering around 70 to 80%. Is that a good figure? Or I guess a follow-up question to that would be what is the average spend for, let's say, Canadians? Obviously, it depends on where you live in Canada, but what would be the average spend?
It's a good question. I'm sort of going off the top of my head here. Statistics Canada puts out information about spending by different age groups, and I know I've written a couple articles in the Financial Post about this. I think the average senior spends somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000 per year based on Statistics Canada data. There's been some good research by a couple of mutual fund companies as well about what the average Canadian spends. Obviously, it differs significantly. I have retiree clients who spend, well over $100,000 per year or more, and some that can live very comfortably. I think those sorts of averages are helpful to know about, but I think the main thing is whatever you're spending going into retirement, the most likely outcome is that you're going to see a slight decline in the early years of retirement. And there's this concept called the retirement spending smile that has been around for a few years. It was written about by Morningstar Investment Research a few years back. And sort of the idea is in the early years of retirement, your spending tends to decline. And if you're lucky or arguably unlucky enough to live a long life, your spending often increases because you can't shovel the snow, cut the grass, you may have long-term care costs, but tends to be sort of a U-shaped spending trajectory on your living expenses during retirement.
Great. We have a question actually from the audience, and I believe it's a bit of a follow-up to my question. Is 70% a reasonable replacement rate?
It depends, and one thing I like to distinguish between is replacing your income and a replacement ratio for your expenses. Sometimes they can be a little bit confused. There can be somebody who is making $100,000 a year going into retirement who can live very comfortably in retirement off of $50,000 per year, and that's a 50% decrease in their income. I myself don't like to focus so much on income, it's more on expenses. And like I said, generally speaking, if you identify someone's core living expenses, what you're spending in the years approaching retirement, if it declines much, 5 or 10% down to say 90% of what you were spending pre-retirement, maybe you're not commuting as much, eating out as much, whatever the case may be, that can happen. But as an expense replacement ratio, sometimes it's more. Sometimes people are spending 110% of what they were because they're traveling. They can golf, whatever the case may be. So the answer I would say is it depends, and particularly when you're looking at income or expense replacement ratios, I think you're much better off trying to identify your own personal situation.
We often hear of retirees downsizing. Is that prudent? Is that recommended? And I guess it would depend on the situation.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of different factors that are included there. For one, I think that particularly in the Greater Toronto area where we are, there's a lot of people with a lot of home equity built up that arguably, if that's not considered in retirement, I would say that there might be people that are saving too much or that are going to leave their kids too large an inheritance. It depends. If that's important to you, then that's one thing. But I think there are a lot of people that if they included their home equity as part of their retirement plan, they possibly could retire earlier or spend more. That doesn't apply in a lot of other places across Canada, but I think that it's something that people should take into account. Is downsizing part of your plan? Do you own a second property, like a cottage that you might be selling someday? And the non-financial aspect, quite frankly, is I see a lot of people who get into positions where they're in 2-story homes and or living somewhere rurally on land and need to do a lot of work to take care of it, and they wait too long to move somewhere else. Not even necessarily a financial downsize. You could be selling one thing and buying something more suitable for the same price on one level or in a condo. But there can be a lot of risks to staying too long in a house that's not suitable as you age as well.
Maybe could you touch on maybe some of the issues around rising costs of healthcare and how people should start thinking about that as part of their budgeting in retirement?
That one I can say is such a tricky one because when you talk about inflation and cost of living increase, generally speaking, the cost of living is increasing in Canada at about 2%. That's the target for the Bank of Canada. There are certain expenses that retirees incur, healthcare most notably, that are increasing at much more than 2% inflation. And I think particularly for retirees, the ones that I've seen get into trouble financially aren't those who underestimate how much they're going to spend on eating out at restaurants or golfing or whatever the case may be. It's those who run into healthcare issues. And it's usually not, like sometimes people ask, should I go out and buy a private health insurance plan that covers my glasses and my dentist and stuff like that? And those aren't the expenses that tend to derail your retirement. It's long-term care costs. It's having something happen where one or both spouses require some level of long-term care. And it's tough. You can go out and you can buy long-term care insurance to protect against that risk, but it's one of the most difficult things to plan for, because if you require long-term care, is it going to be for a month when you're 99 years old? Is it going to be for 10 years when you're 68? Some people, I think, if they have a fairly high budget expectation going to retirement, lots of travel, whatever, it's a lot easier to absorb those costs than somebody with a very modest, razor-thin budget. And likewise, if somebody has a home that is, has a high value, that's even a little bit of a buffer. But long-term care costs, I find, are one of the biggest challenges going into retirement.
That's fair. Maybe just to switch gears here a bit, for those of that are on the webinar here this afternoon that may not know. For those that may not have a defined benefit plan or a company-sponsored plan, and they're looking at withdrawing personal savings, what accounts should they touch first from a tax standpoint?
That's a great question, and I find oftentimes the knee-jerk reaction is to pull money from the cheapest places. And what I mean by that is, people will say, oh, my tax-free savings account, it's tax-free, I want to pull money from there. Or, people have gone through a lifetime of being told, contribute to your RSP, defer income tax. And I think generally speaking, when somebody retires, most people, with a big asterisk, are well suited to starting early withdrawals from their RSP. I have clients yesterday, they're 55 years old, and I was recommending they start withdrawals from their RSPs. Oftentimes, deferring your registered withdrawals till age 72, which is when the government makes you start taking money out, is not the right approach. Oftentimes, you'll pay less lifetime tax by starting to take a little bit of money from your RSPs. And it can be really tricky if you've got other accounts like taxable investment accounts, rental real estate, home equity. It's a bit of a puzzle trying to fit together what's the right approach. And I often use the phrase, it is more art than science, but more often than not, starting RSP withdrawals, at least some modest withdrawals, I think makes sense.
And for those that have left their employer that no longer have benefits, you talked about long-term care and so on, but what about those that may have lost benefits that they once had at their employer? What are your recommendations there in budgeting for that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wrote an article about it a couple of weeks ago in Money Sense. And it's a question I get a lot. People lose their benefits. They wonder if they should go out and buy a private health insurance plan. My answer is generally no. And one of the main reasons is I think that insurance companies, I know insurance companies are in business to make money. And when it comes to a health insurance plan, you've got limits about how much you can get back. Like if you did dental, massage, chiropractic, glasses, everything, podiatrist, everything you could possibly do, there's still limits about how much you could get back. And the insurance company is kind of like a casino. They're not going to be around unless they win in the long run. And if you paid $3,000 in premiums and got back $4,000, that's not a viable business model for them. Individual health insurance premiums can change from year to year. And in the unlikely event you get back more than you paid in, there's a reasonable chance your premiums could increase the next year. So generally, I suggest that people do not opt for private health insurance unless it's part of their retiree program and maybe their employer is paying some of it. Again, it's long-term care costs that are not covered by a health plan that are the biggest risk, not needing to get a cavity fixed.
Okay, fair enough. I guess the other question I had for you is there anything else our viewers today need to know? Obviously, we've talked about non-essential, essential, your fixed expenses, housing, food, transportation. What are some one-time events that people should plan for in retirement? Whatever the case.
I think that's a really
Extraordinary.
important one.
Yeah.
There, a lot of times, again, people have these ideal budgets about how much they can spend in retirement, and oftentimes we'll sit down with people and we look at how much they say they're spending, we look at their after-tax income, and we say there's a big gap. Did you save that money? And the answer invariably is no. It was for extraordinary expenses and cash withdrawals from the ATM and whatever. And those things are likely to continue on an ongoing basis. There's always going to be repairs on your car or your home or a wedding to go to or whatever the case may be. So I think it's really important to be generous in retirement and account for those unexpected expenses. We often, when we're building out a retirement budget for a client, will ask them, when are you going to replace your car next? How much do you think you're going to spend? What repairs and renovations do you think you're going to do on your home? And even if the answer is none, we'll say, okay, well, we're going to add in an incremental cost because we all know there's going to be something that you don't anticipate. Kids, that's the other thing I see a lot of people that have extraordinary expenses for their kids, going through a divorce, need help with the down payment, have a disabled child, whatever the case may be. You need to anticipate the unexpected because invariably it will become a reality.
Okay. Any final thoughts for us today?
One thing that I'll offer up, particularly going into retirement, I may have alluded to this last time. I spend a good part of my day helping people live to 100 and not run out of money. And there was a mother at my children's school who died earlier this week, 49 years old. Her funeral's today. And if only we knew how long we were going to live, it would make retirement planning a lot easier. So despite all this stuff that I do to try to help people to not run out of money, all the rules of thumb and ratios and the math aside, you need to balance a little bit and live for today, save for tomorrow. And I'm biased because we do retirement planning for clients. Not everybody needs a professional. I think at the very least, sitting down and trying to educate yourself and learning about some of these things on your own can give you a lot of peace of mind and really have you prepared and ready for retirement.
Great, great. We actually have one final question that came in here. We talked about downsizing your home, but what about staying in your home and the costs associated with that?
Yeah, I think that oftentimes I'll work with clients where we'll build out a long-term retirement plan and show them, look, if you stay in your current home, you're going to run out of investments by age 80. Are you okay with that? Are you okay with knowing and planning that you will need to use some of your home equity, whether it's by using a line of credit or a reverse mortgage or selling the property in the future? And as long as somebody knows that that's part of their retirement reality, I think that's fine. There's lots of people who do stay in their home, right to the end, and I think there's a lot more baby boomers and older that have gone that route. All the expectations that the baby boomers were going to downsize. There's a lot of younger people these days that are priced out of the housing market as a result. But my experience is that most people do stay in their homes. And as long as you're planning for if and how you need to access that home equity, that can be part of your plan.
Well, I guess the follow-up question to that would be, what are your thoughts on reverse mortgages? You're reading a lot about it, obviously, with the aging demographic here in Canada, people tapping into the equity in their houses. Is that prudent practice? Is that...
It's a great question. I mean, again, I don't sell financial products. I'm unbiased, and I find that a lot of the information I read out there about reverse mortgages, and a reverse mortgage for viewers is kind of like a mortgage in reverse. Basically, it's a way to borrow money against your home equity that you can use to fund your retirement. And there's a lot of negative press out there about reverse mortgages and about how they're bad. And one of the biggest criticisms I see is that it diminishes the inheritance that you're going to leave to your kids. And I kind of scratch my head because I think, well, taking money out of your investments diminishes the inheritance you're going to leave to your kids too. Like, it's your retirement, it's your money, do what you want with it. And with a reverse mortgage, there are situations where when you're retired, the bank won't lend you any money. And the only way you can access your home equity is A, to sell it, or B, to get a reverse mortgage and borrow at a higher rate than somebody would normally pay on a mortgage. But if it's the only option to stay in your home, why not? I think reverse mortgages do have a place, and if it's something that somebody does to spend 5 more years in their home with the expectation that they'll sell the home in 5 years' time, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I'd explore all other options, including borrowing from a bank at a lower rate before a reverse mortgage. You tend to pay a couple percentage points more.
Okay. And one final question, actually. The questions are starting to come in here. In the previous webinar, you suggested that reviewing one's budget annually is adequate. Do you think that frequency is appropriate for retirees as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when I look at most of the clients we work with, we meet them once a year. That's often enough time to sit down and talk about money and finances. Some of the people that I see that really agonize over either their investments or their spending, and they're analyzing it on a daily or a weekly or a monthly basis, I find you can kind of micromanage your finances if you get too involved that way. I think the best approach, in my opinion, is to try to determine going into retirement and revisiting on an annual basis, how much can I afford to spend? Am I on track? And I'm more concerned with how much somebody can afford to spend every month and every year. And as long as they're on track with that, I don't care if they're wasting money on A, B, or C. It doesn't matter what you're spending your money on, as long as you're spending a sustainable amount of money on a monthly or annual basis. everyone's going to have stuff that they quote unquote waste money on. Try not to get too worried about the nitty-gritty details, in my opinion.
Super, great, great. Well, thank you, Jason. Really appreciate your time today.
Sure.
Thanks for being with us again. For those of you on today's webinar, keep an eye out for the next invitation. Couple reminders, the RSP deadline is March 2nd. Keep in mind that you can now contribute to your open access group retirement plan through online banking. And if you're not part of our Retirement Readiness Club, we highly suggest that you reach out to our client service team and get signed up. A lot more content like today's webinar is available, tools, resources, budgeting, calculators that are available to all of you. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you all back for our next webinar. Have a great day.